Started now. So I'd like to say hello and to welcome everybody to this keynote address for this year's WAPOR conference. As you know, this is an annual tradition, and it is my honor to introduce this year's speaker, Marta Lagos. As many of you know, Marta has been an active member of the WAPOR community for many years. For those of you not familiar with Marta's work, let me provide a modest introduction to this amazing woman. Marta is founding director of the Latino Barometro, the first regional barometer after the Eurobarometer. She has conducted opinion polls in Chile since the 1980s transition to democracy in that country. Trained as an economist at Essex University and at the University of Heidelberg, Marta became founding director of her own polling company, Mori, in 1994, in association with the British firm Mori UK. Today, she is recognized internationally for her work monitoring the Chilean transition to democracy over the past 35 years. Marta is currently a member of the executive committee of the World Values Survey and has served as coordinator of the Federation of Regional Barometers over the last decade. She was also a member of the steering committee of the International Comparative Elections Studies from 1994 to 2008, and has previously served on the WAPOR Council and as an editor of the International Journal of Public Opinion Research. Perhaps most importantly, Marta was the 2008 recipient of the WAPOR Dinnerman Award for distinguished contributions to public opinion research for her achievements in building the Latino Barometro. She is also currently WAPOR's national representative for Chile. I'd now like to give the floor to Marta for her presentation, after which we'll have time for discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tim. It is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here in this virtual space at the WAPOR conference. And thank you very much for inviting me to do this talk on problematic that polls face today in our part of the world. I see several of my colleagues here also from Latin America. So I have titled my presentation today, Alle, Nicht, Jeder, which means all, not everyone. These are the words of Elizabeth Noelle Neumann that are very simple, yet so many seem to be unable to understand them, especially media, journalists, and editors. There's a growing concern about how much manipulation there is in producing and publishing polls, and how much are polls able to reveal the truth to power, especially when not all are included. How much are the polls being used to maintain power of ruling authorities and not defending the interest of the voters? Well, the growing importance of polls in the media lead to two main debates. One, on the one hand, the accuracy and quality of polls coverage in the news. On the other, the effect on the electorate. And a third concern is the impact of polls in the elite and the fear it triggers, producing multiple initiatives to restrict, regulate, and ban polls. Media coverage can at times be controversial, and the risk is greater when polls and projections are conducted by a source that is not impartial. Donsmark and Hartmut distinguished two types of political regimes to analyze ban on polls: democracies and non-democracies. Latin America and the case of Chile suggest an addition of a third dimension: imperfect consolidated democracies, semi-sovereign states. So let's rephrase. Who is in fact in charge of protecting the interest of the voters in an imperfect consolidated democracy? Imperfect democracies like those in Latin America, but not only, very few are, or maybe no one. And what is the role of polls in that process? Well, 22% of the population in Latin America say that the governments works for the majority. In Chile, it is only 8%. According to the latest Latino Barometro report. Interpersonal trust in the region is only 12%, in Chile 17%, the lowest of all regions of the world. With this trust towards power and towards the other, where do we stand? The responsibility of pollsters is enhanced at the light of these deficiencies of democracy. Manipulation of information is by far more easy when the average education of a population in a case like Chile is low. Only 25% have more than 8 years, and 50% have more than 12 years, and 50% have less than 12 years of education, leaving a larger space for populism and other forms of non-democratic regimes and like autocracies. Polling organizations have an enhanced responsibility to voters in those regimes to ensure that polls, especially those polls published, provide reliable and objective information into political systems that are on the evolution and are fragile. This is easily said, but in order to do so, polling organizations have to be seen as legitimate and ethically correct. Distortion of reality, partisanship of media in the publication, wrong prediction of elections produce distrust, lower legitimacy, enabling polls to fulfill its role. When media does not distinguish what they're publishing, has no ability to compare, and is partisan in their reporting, letting anything be seen as valid, it is very difficult to defend the integrity of the industry and the validity of the instrument. Together with the decay of the political system, there has been a decay of electoral and political polling, at least in my country, Chile. One must add to that consensus of the consequences of pandemia, who has produced a sudden change in the application mode to panel surveys. The first dimension affected by that change is the quality of representation of the population that has declined, and the error in elections predictions that has increased. All are not included in panel surveys. There is a second dimension to that change, and Noelle Neumann asked herself the question on the implication that the introduction of telephone would have in opinion research. Telephone is more rational and cold than the face-to-face emotional interaction of two human beings, she said. Who is researching about the impact of sudden shift to panels surveys due to the pandemic? Internet is even more rational than telephone. There is no human contact at all. What is the impact of that remoteness in the comprehension of the questions, how they are understood and how they're responded in a region where emotions are the greater part of the existence, like in Latin America? Public opinion is in fact the result of the interaction among human beings and not the isolated collection of individual responses, although responses are collected individually. They can only collect what is common to a given population. I have had the opportunity to visit Cuba many times, and about 15 years ago, managed to apply 50 in-depth interviews of men and women who lived in La Habana. Although I have not published that paper, in a draft I conclude that in those days there was no public opinion at all. People were not able to express an opinion different to that official opinion. They did not know what it was to be asked their views. They had no knowledge they could have a view at all. The idea of freedom of expression was unknown to these 60 individuals. They could talk about weather, their health, and their family activities, but no vision of collective thinking in any respect. There is nothing common to a given population, then there is no public opinion, and nothing can be drawn from it. Although it is an extreme, it is a benchmark to start researching societies. How much interaction is there? On what terms is that interaction, and what themes are present? What can we learn from that? What is a social fact? Durkheim raised this question already in 1895. We must in fact first identify the public opinion issue that is being researched. Is it at all an issue where there is an opinion, a social fact, upon which research can be applied? Manipulation is also easy when results are produced on issues that are not part of public opinion. You can try to insert in the agenda certain issues with the help of polls, even if they're not part of the public opinion. The questionnaire is the core of the matter. No technology can replace the design. It is a source of sound and rigorous information, but it is also a source of maximum manipulation. There is no greater manipulation than a subtle bias question or a dichotomy over a complex subject to reduce pluralism. The design of questions can influence and help or disarm those who are trying to retain power by misinforming a low-educated population. This is a political issue facing polls in Chile today, in the middle of a major epochal change. Us pollsters know the instrument is powerful. The chemistry between the interviewer and the respondent, a well-designed questionnaire in a carefully designed sample and fieldwork does work when all are included. It is by all means possible to measure reality very near its actual behavior. These simple rules allowed us in 1988 to anticipate the defeat of the dictator, although about 1,000 political scientists at WAPOR that year had looked at the numbers and said, it is impossible, it must be wrong. In that case, the instrument was powerful beyond expert opinion. Today, 33 years later, we stand at a point where the industry has been banned from publishing polls 15 days before the election, and second, are under the extreme criticism for having predicted in July that the wrong candidates would win the nomination to the presidency in a primary election. Polls are no longer respected and valid instrument, which does not mean that they're not used. Everybody uses them and throws them at the face of the opponent. It has become a political instrument, a weapon, very far from the mission to present truth to power. Politicians and media are using them now as a cat's paw. Prestige and image of the ability of surveys to reflect reality is being questioned. It is now more important than ever to return to basics, restore the quality of representation, and prove the strength of the instrument. This is why I stand here today talking to you. The scenario is very simple. Polls published in pre-election period are inevitably seen as prediction of the election result. Pre-election polls are a public test of sampling theory. They should not have a sample of less than 1,000 respondents. In some cases, like in Chile, it should be larger. These standards are known to us, but turn quite useless when they are seen as an opinion and not as a standard. In 1999, the actual president, Sebastián Piñera, was head of the foundation, Fundación Futuro, producing election polls for the presidential election that year. They applied telephone polls of 4,000 cases when landline coverage was only 40%. In those days, we had founded a public opinion survey association with other fellow pollsters who had agreed on standards. Sebastián Piñera, a forged millionaire, a former senator, won the battle against standards with his survey that was below standard, saying ESOMAR and WAPOR standards were too high, quote unquote, for a country like Chile, stating he would by no means, quote unquote, accept them. This row over standards led to the dissolution of the association because of lack of consensus with respect to minimum standards. This was in fact a political dispute, since those posters against standards belonged to the right and rallied behind Piñera. All they wanted was to lead the agenda. This was probably a turning point for public opinion surveys in Chile. Since then, pollsters have had no collective standards, although some pollsters subscribe them. With no benchmark, it is all a matter of opinion. Media will refer to standards as, quote unquote, some say this should be this or that way. Public opinion pollsters in Chile have today no association of their own, although many are members of the Market Research Association. I can responsibly say polls have been degraded in Chile to a political instrument used for an ideological fight. It is not about to try to tell the truth to power, but about what some few dominant actors make and set the agenda with the help of surveys and the passive or non-passive complicity of journalists and media. In the 7 elections that have taken place this year, we find the following scenario for polls. First, political use of polls. Political parties, they use informal, non-professional polls to decide who is a candidate for a particular district. And candidates in the May election use polls for their campaigns. They commission polls to non-established professional organizations and single individuals. Only 3 out of 70 organizations used this election were professional ones. With 16,731 candidates, only 156 candidates commissioned polls for any sort, with any sort of organization. When the Market Research Association was asked about this, they said they had no knowledge of any. with the exception of the universities. Here you have, oops. Okay, here you have the list of the organizations and the list of the elections. There are 4 elections on that day. And of course, the question we ask ourselves is political polling seen as a non-professional activity that can be carried out by an undetermined number of individuals and organizations? Is it because of distrust, because it's cheaper? Is politics so informal that political polling is seen as not accessible to candidates? Are candidates so poor they seek cheaper informal applications? All these questions have to be asked. Is there at all professional polling when seen this way by the candidates in the 4 elections? Further on, we see that professional polling organizations in Chile publish regularly polling on the house financed by themselves. They are only source of political polling. This means there is no one is commissioning a polling organization to produce an election tracking of vote intention in this election. There are no joint ventures between pollsters and media. And with respect to the independence of media publishes polls not according to accuracy, methodological soundness, or past performance. They simply publish it all without questions. Independent media is scarce. Partisan media and cherry picking are very much the usual. Very little professional expertise is available among journalists. They use the word polling for many things that are no polls. Editors have little knowledge, and almost 10 years after the beginning of voluntary voting, they do not make a difference between vote intention with and without likely voters. Sometimes media coverage of polls is confusing. And I will show you some of the agenda setting. 2 months before the election, a leading tank published a poll with 2 questions about the presidential election. The speaker of the think tank that produced the poll at the press conference, which was reproduced live by CNN for about 40 minutes, said, most relevant is the high percentage of people who do not know or do not answer this question. The question was, who would you like for to be president? It was an open-ended question. We have 50% of the population who does not have a preferred president. This is particularly interesting, and you can see in this the page of this newspaper, because neither the producer nor the data nor the media that publishes mentions at all in any part of the report that is 50% of the voters in Chile do not vote since 2012. The headline of the newspaper gives hence the impression that the election is totally open. The leading candidate belongs to the opposition in both questions and is the runner-up, while the newspaper is an advocate of the government. So it is in their interest to set the agenda that the election is open. This poll does set agenda in the main printed media, which and the producers, the think tank belongs to one of the families that control 20% of the GDP. With this result, they install the idea that anything can happen on the 21st of November. So you can see this is no subtle misrepresentation. This is an intended misrepresentation of the facts. Now, the evaluation of performance of polls is also political. A given pollster can have a result in the order in which the candidates obtain the votes in the election. If it is a favorite pollster of that media, it will be titled as correct, independent of the difference with the results of the election. In the first 20 years of transition, when compulsory voting was in place, the pollster was not only expected to produce a close result to the election, but also were punished when not. This changed when voluntary voting, installed in 2012, was enforced, especially because some pollsters declared it impossible to predict with voluntary voting because one cannot know how many will turn out to vote. Yet, where is the incentive to be accurate when those who get it wrong have no sanction? If publishing a graph with numbers on each candidate is enough, why bother to get it right? A weekly poll published every Sunday night, predicted the victory of two candidates that lost, each one in their own primary election, even calculating likely voters. This is the same survey that suffered no redesign after failure, is the main source of information for the presidential election today, which is taking place in 20 days. And it is the main source because it is the most cited, the most repeated, and the most used as argument by all social and political actors. But it is a substandard telephone survey of 700 cases trying to predict an election where only in that, the one I'm going to show, only 20% of the turnout of people turned out to vote. So there's no surprise that they got it wrong. So here you can see, this is the classical representation of the vote intention of this survey, which shows all electorate, the whole of the electorate, the 700 cases, the response of one question and the evolution of that question. The one that published before the primary election got the leading candidate that won the most votes had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th position. This person here, Gabriel Boric, with 1 million votes. And the one who got the 2nd position was 4th in this vote, in this survey, got 659,000 votes. So it is not a slight mistake. Now, they tried to estimate the participation in the primary election, and they said 47% would not vote, 26% would vote for these red coalition, which is 3.9 million votes, 19% would vote for the blue coalition with 2.5 million votes. And this means that they estimated that 6,400,000 people would go to vote from a total of 15 million. But the actual participation in the election was 21% with 3 million. So the overestimation was about 3 million votes. And not only that, but the estimation of who won was even worse, because they estimated this candidate to win in one of the primaries, Daniel Jadue. He got 692,000 votes, while the one who won got 1 million votes and was predicted with only 40%. He got 60%. In the other primary, it was the same. He was predicted 23% and he obtained 49%. So this is part of the mishap that has happened to surveys in Chile. And now, of course, there are other polls. There are polls that are published every 15 days or once a month. But of course, they're swallowed in the agenda by this Sunday night poll that is published every week. And therefore, this is the main agenda setting instrument that is even today in place. Now, if you add this is a result of the election. I'll leave all this for you. If you add all this, and we add the application mode change, panel surveys have very few people over 60 years of age, very few people with low education levels, and very few people from less populated areas, not only the countryside, but less populated, small towns. And of course, the representation is not full. And of course, there is no poll at the time that supplies, I would say, a supplementary sample of those populations that are weekly represented in the sample. And therefore, all polls other than that telephone poll are done by these panel surveys. Now, if we go to the likely voter problem and look at the presidential election, we see that some, as I said, some pollsters publish the simple Sunday question with all the candidates every month or every 15 days. Media reproduces the data as if it were a vote intention calculation of voter turnout with or without it, not distinguishing the differences. So you have here, again, this electoral expert, Kenneth Bunker, commenting on Twitter, the last election, the last survey of that year, of the 24th of October is this one, giving a certain result. And you have here CNN saying that this candidate is far away, or is getting far away from Boric, Kast, the one leading, from the second one, Boric, and he consolidates in the first place, with a difference that is smaller than the margin of error. So journalists read numbers, and if you have 3 points difference between the two candidates, this means that one is consolidated in the first place and the other one is second, although the margin of error of 700 cases reported by that pollster is 3.7%. Now, on the same day that poll was published, this other poll was published by another pollster that gave the one, Boric, had 20% in the other survey, has 31% in this survey, and Kast had 23% in the other survey, has 28% in this survey. So there's a candidate, Boric, that has over 10 points difference in two surveys published the same day. This was only a week ago, or a little over a week ago. And what do you see? The first survey was published in all the media, all TV channels, 10 o'clock news, 9 o'clock news. This survey was published only in one radio. And most surprisingly, no one addresses the difference between those two numbers. So it is as if you have two different universes. Now, this is the setting that where polls are being done in Chile. Here you have the main paper, the Sunday paper, El Mercurio, publishing on, this is August, but there's too many, publishing this poll from a university, and with no likely voters on the presidential race. And look what it says. This is a technical reference. Total universe, 3,591 cases. Targeted group, men and women of 18 years of age living in continental Chile. Simple random selection. It doesn't say whether it's telephone or whatever, or other things, or a sample or a panel. Field work from 1,900 hours on August 24th to 2,000 hours on August 25th. There's no interview mode, no measurement of margin of error. There's a confusion of concepts. There's no likely voter, no indicator of participation. And you can see this, over and over in the same type. This is another day with the same type of poll and the same type of, this isn't from October, exactly the same, different numbers, of course, and the candidates, of course, they move their positions. But the fact is, we don't even know whether this is a panel or a telephone survey. It doesn't say. So you need to go into the webpage and try to find it, if you find it. I mean, if you have the tools to go and find it. Otherwise, what you do is you just buy the fact that this is the possible result of the election. But there is no likely voter here, with 50% of the population not voting. And what is the result of all this? Well, you have here foreign correspondents taking the polls as a valid one, the whole set of presidential preferences without likely voters. You have the complaint against pollsters by different, you open Twitter and there's, the flow of complaints. There's trending topics on complaints. And then you have the other actors like this radio who produces a presidential poll recruited through social media. And they say, please participate in this presidential election from Radio Agricultura. And then, of course, they publish the results. And then we wonder why polls in Chile are being absolutely destructed in their image and reputation. This is CNN again, or some other I don't think CNN would publish things like that in the United States. So maybe we're talking about different organizations here. But the other thing one needs to address is the ban on polls, 15-day polls. The presidential election, the Constitutional Tribunal Court fundamented this law on that restricted 15 days publication of polls for the election. It says, quote, "This restriction can manifest its greater virtue in the most contested election, and since the channels of information and dissemination of these electoral ideas are all open, the limitation of an instrument can be constituted, and that in other places has been constituted in severe manipulation is admissible." Wolfgang Donsbach was right. Polls are banned under the assumption that there is a detrimental effect. Even social sciences has not been able to demonstrate that polls have a specific effect on the electorate. That effect is in fact mixed. Many members of the elite do not believe this. They believe they do have an effect and that there are many negative effects. The fear of polls leads to restriction and bans. And of course, the mistakes on polls enhances that. The fact that we have an imperfect democracy and produce, with all these elements, produce exactly the contrary effect. We are not protecting the interests of the voters. We're doing the contrary. We're confusing the voters. The role of media is crucial in being able or not being able to protect the interests of the voters. And Alejandro Moreno, one of our colleagues, he has been able to write about the subject matter of election polls in the Mexican newspapers extensively. Mexico, Peru, and Argentina, Uruguay, they're way ahead of Chile in this respect. I haven't seen any of these phenomena happening in those countries. In fact, Mexico and Peru just had elections and they did very well. They performed excellently. So what is wrong with us? There is no doubt a desired standard, although the existence of independent media is also a necessary condition for the independent political polls to be published fairly. The problem in a country like Chile is that in election time, non-partisan media is almost non-existent. Partisan media in elections tend to produce cherry-picking results according to the best interest. Media reporting of polls has been misleading, and report headlines sometimes are not supported by the data they are publishing in the past election in Chile. And in the present election today, media contributing to being part of the solution, rather not. Media is mostly part of the problem, precisely in the ability of recognizing what it is they're representing. What is the public? That is why the public is skeptical and distrustful of media, which in turn speaks in favor of the absence or little effect on polls and publications. Relaxed standards in producing polls are accompanied by very relaxed or no standards in reporting polls with accuracy. Media does not pose any questions, just publishes at face value. The result of all these deviations from ideal type of behavior of polls and media is that the interest is affected in its credibility and hence the industry. It is not a good thing when it is in the mouth of every social media participant that polls are wrong. People do not distinguish names of companies, they punish the instrument. It is today in Chile a bad thing to be a pollster. One is part of something that doesn't work properly. Elizabeth Noelle Neumann, Yankelovich, Wooster, they have all complained in these about the same issues. There's nothing new about the issues. Only they complain from established democracies with strong institutions. We are complaining at the light of events in a country in the middle of an economic, political, social, and sanitary crisis, with the constitution being drafted in a weak political environment with high levels of social unrest. Polls in these circumstances have become political actors, affecting the course of events. The task of reporting the least unbiased reality has never been more important than today. And we find ourselves exactly in the opposite position at a moment when The Economist on October 28th, this past week, has declared Chile is in trouble. Quote, events of recent weeks suggest that it actually resembles one of its dysfunctional neighbors, unquote. Poles have been also victims of dictatorship because they weaken social sciences. They have developed and re-inaugurated democracy in Chile in the private sector and have remained there without creating a community of peers interacting and producing science. They nevertheless played an important role in transition, accompanying and giving light to changes. In the past 10 years, the crisis of the political system has affected the production of polls inasmuch as political actors were increasingly not interested in research and information and knowledge about society. Dominant actors see polls as a competition to their power. This is how we arrive at this point. We face a presidential race with a degraded system of polling, no proper electoral polls, including voter turnout, in a system where, in fact, there is no individual punishment if you're wrong. Punishment is then taken by the industry as a whole. Are the politicians looking from the gallery as actors, thinking they do not need polls? So that the 15-day ban becomes almost irrelevant fact because it may be convenient for those who are in power that the general public is not well informed? Is it probably convenient for those who are in power that only one out of two Chileans do not vote in this election either? Democracy will take longer to consolidate if the instruments that help its evolution are degraded or silenced in any way. We feel this is the case of the electoral polls in this election in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. What's in
Thank
the applause is virtual.
Okay, I don't know how long I took, but you know.
About 35 minutes.
Oh, that's good.
We would like to open the floor to questions for Marta on her really fascinating remarks. And while folks are collecting their thoughts, Marta, I have a question for you. I was taken by your point, which of course is absolutely correct, that the questionnaire itself is a source of manipulation, albeit it's also our main communication tool for establishing shared meaning between respondents and researchers. I'd like to think, and this may be naive, that a lot of, if there's manipulation in the questionnaire, it can be detected if it sees the light of day. And I've noted that several countries now have instituted programs to try and systematize the reporting of methodological details, which would enable us to identify these kind of problems with surveys. I think, for example, the WAPOR webinar that was held last Friday talked, one of the speakers spoke about in the Czech Republic, the survey passport, that the news media require the certain elements of disclosure, question wording, and sample descriptions and population eligibility and so forth, before they'll publish the results of a poll. And in the United States, there's the APOR-led Transparency Initiative, which is more of a voluntary thing. Certain organizations volunteer to disclose those methodological details. Do you think that these kind of methodological disclosures can address this problem of manipulation in questionnaires? Are they adequate?
Well, I think that the APOR initiative is excellent. We had a webinar here, a local webinar with the Transparency Corporation that is inside the Chilean state. And they showed very much interest in trying to install some sort of Chilean version of the Transparency Initiative. That would be fantastic. I mean, if if it goes through, because it needs, of course, the approval of many people before it does. But the thing is that, you know, the opinion pollsters here, they have no benchmark at all. They just you know, go by the way they want to go, and I think that's the weakest part, because there's no group of peers, there is no publication, there is no journal, there is no annual congress, there is no place where you can get together with other pollsters to try to talk about, you know, the mistakes, the development of science, or questionnaires, or whatever it is. So you know, the deficiencies of the way the polls work in Chile, it was not so in the 90s. There was much more community there. There was much more possibility of interacting one with the other and getting together and discussing. Now it is completely gone. And I think society and politics has also gone the same way. So we are, in fact, a victim of what's happening in the country. But I would think a professional organization should be able to, you know, to go above, you know, the crisis of the political system and not be swallowed by it. But I do think, yes, you know, the manipulation of questions here is a clever one, because, you know, as I say, they reduce a very complex thing to a dichotomy. And of course, even if you have 40% of people who don't answer because they don't want to, you still have, you know, a relevant number that you can publish in favor or against one of the two positions. And this has been done. It's been done weekly on important issues. And this is why I say, you know, it leads the course of events sometimes, because some politicians or somebody in Congress uses it as an example to pass a law or to vote against a law. So yes, I think, you know, we urgently need some sort of support from anybody and everybody to try to, you know, go a step forward there, at least.
Thank you, Marta. I see Alejandro has a hand raised.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Marta, for a very interesting conversation about the pre-election polls in Chile. Of course, I think that the emphasis you make in transparency, Tim, is very important, and I would include the practices for the likely voters estimators. I think this is very interesting, and I must say that perhaps you mentioned this, I don't remember, but one of the main challenges in Chile is that you had compulsory voting for forever. And now you're changing to voluntary voting. And this is what is making the likely voter estimation very interesting. I understand that turnout has been reduced significantly in general elections, but the primary elections usually have even less participation, less turnout than general elections. So this is a real issue. And I was wondering if you could tell us more or less what you saw in the published polls, what they used to estimate likely voters. I know that this is going to be a trial and error. They sometimes work, they sometimes don't. They may be helpful, they may be hurtful. But it's interesting that as a methodology, Chilean pollsters are getting into it. So what questions are they using? What assumptions are they making? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I do think that precisely, you know, the development and discussion of, you know, what are the leading variables that one needs to use in order to be able to distinguish those who vote and those who don't is one of the things you should be able to do in a peer consultation, in congresses, in panels, and in articles. And of course, we have here no information except from what is published in the polls. There are two polls, only two, who publish likely voters. And one of them uses 3 questions, a combination, without, of course, telling what the actual combination of the responses are. The thing is that we have tried we have tried the likely voter model from WAPOR. We have tried many models of likely voters that are being published in the literature. And we have come up with a I would say, local in-house combination of using 5 questions. Because if you produce, I have 2 elections to compare backwards, you know, and you can always tell backwards which would have been the combination that give you the actual turnout of that election. Okay, so that I can do with the 2017 presidential election, which is the first election, presidential election with voluntary voting. This is the second one, and it is possible. It is possible. What is needed is, first of all, you need very large samples. You need at least 3,000 samples. You need to drop 1,500 cases. If you don't have a large sample, you are most likely to make a big mistake, because the nuances between those who were almost ready to go to vote is 20% over or less. We find, and I have an article written on this, that 20% of the Chilean population would like to go to vote on election day, and they cannot reach the poll location on that day for several logistical problems. They didn't have money for the bus, the location was too far away, they didn't have a place to leave the children, etc., etc., etc. So they were not in their registered place. They couldn't change the address of the registration, etc. I think that there is this logistical problem that enhances very blurred the amount of likely voters that you need to sieve out, you need to leave out by asking the people, are you going to be in the place where you're going to vote on the day of your election? Because if they say no, then that person, even if he wants to go to vote, he won't be able to do so. So the amount of information you need to gather in order to get it right is quite large. And I think that 3 questions, this pollster who has done a very good job in trying to predict elections with likely voters, has a rough estimate, and his estimate has been estimating voter turnout, precisely for those type of very small minorities who have these characteristics for which you need a larger sample. And of course, when all the samples you're applying and the political system doesn't demand very sophisticated surveys, but only very cheap ones, they don't pay for these 3,000 cases, then the chances are it's more difficult to get it right. So there's a trade-off there, between what it is you can accomplish with what you have and what it is you can accomplish if you had what you need to have.
Claire, you have a question?
Yes. Comment and comment in a way. First, I think we should not be pessimistic. In Canada, for a long time, it was extremely difficult to have any information on the polls that were conducted. And with time, pressure built, and pressure builds because the pollsters understand at one point that when there are problems, it is all the pollsters that are attacked, and not only those who had these problems. So the whole industry needs transparency, and with time, pollsters understand that. And I can tell you that in Canada, the people who were the most resistant to transparency are now the ones who have the most transparent reports. Okay,
That's nice.
So that's really interesting.
That's very nice.
Okay, my second point is about a likely voter model, and then I have to say that I disagree with you. I think there is too much emphasis on likely voter models, partly because people may say they will not vote because they just don't want to say who they are going to vote for, or because they want to finish the survey rapidly, or because they just don't know finally and they will finally vote. And I can give you a number of examples. In Canada, we had 2 or 3 extremely bad elections where like polls were 17% off, 17 percentage points off, and another case 10. And pollsters have tried to see if they use a likely voter model, would they have predicted well? And the answer to this was it would have been worse. Okay, and so they tried again in the next election, and they say, okay, one pollster decided to publish with and without the likely voter model, and
That's not bad.
yeah, that's not bad, and the results were better without the likely voter model. The Sturgis report for UK concluded that the likely voter model does not do any improvement on the estimation. The WAPOR 2016 report on the US election of 2016 also concluded that the likely voter models do not have any impact. In fact, there was no difference between those who use and didn't use a likely voter model. So in Canada, nobody uses a likely voter model. So I think we have to be very likely voter model have advantages and disadvantages, and it can be very dangerous also, because this is the only moment where pollsters can manipulate data in a way. So if you think it is important, it should be published along with, without likely voter model and with likely voter model, 2 set of estimates, and then it would be better, or at least in the transparency. People have to say what they have before they apply a likely voter model.
Yes, but I mean, what I showed you was that, the non-likely voter model was even more wrong than the one with likely voter model. So, I mean, the distance was enormous in both cases. Well, my point is that, if you don't have the proper sample size, the proper methodology, even with a fantastic likely voter model, you're going to get it wrong. So you have different dimensions where, there is a substandard condition. Now, with respect to the likely voter model, I'm sorry to say what I'm listening to your comment, I would say, well, it's just because they haven't developed a good likely voter model. I mean, something should be done so that, the likely voter model works. Because if it doesn't work, it doesn't make any sense to use it. So why repeat something that doesn't work? That would be my comment on that. So, but I mean, we have had elections where the likely voter model works. Now, the big question here is today, we have elections in 19 days, is that are the polls that are being published, especially by this leading poll who marks the agenda, going to produce the same type of error that was produced in the primary election? Or is it going to reflect exactly, very near what's going to happen? Because there doesn't seem to be, well, any credibility on the numbers, of course, but then we stand in the black room. This is the question, Of course, if you have a likely voter model, and there are 2 pollsters here in Chile who do, they publish with and without, and I think that's fair. That's okay. But I would say the problem now is that we stand in the black room and everybody thinks that everybody's going to get it wrong. That's the problem. And that was produced by a mistake. Tim, floor back to you.
Yep, okay. Thank you, Marta. I think it is just a few minutes before the top of the hour, and I see no more questions. So,
Ignacio, Ignacio.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry.
Thomas and Ignacio.
all
Thomas
right,
and
okay.
Ignacio.
Thomas, you first. Very quick questions. We have about 4 minutes, so 2 minutes for you and 2 minutes for Ignacio.
Yes, I'm very brief. I'm afraid that we can use the most sophisticated survey methodology in the world as long as journalists are not educated to understand what we are doing. We will still have shitty reporting on our polls. So I'm interested if there are any programs to educate journalists in Chile to understand better how polling works.
Well, yes, we have tried. The thing is that, you know, in order to do that, you need to have posters who believe they don't know. Journalists who believe they don't know. Because when the journalists think that, you know, they do know, they don't go to any seminar, webinar, or whatever it is you want to give them. And they don't read anything because they already know. So it's what we call in German, Besserwisser, you know, so there's nothing we can do there. You know, just change the journalist, maybe. Floor back to you, Tim.
Over to Ignacio.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Marta, for your presentation. A couple of comments in a few minutes. What is happening in Chile is what is happening in the whole world now. There are really very deep troubles we have to face. We have one challenge is inside our profession, inside our community. Maybe we need to reinforce and to look contact points between the industry because we have new actors with different formation and different scopes, and it's better maybe to integrate them to educate in some way new colleagues than to have them in the other side of the street. And the journalist is also a big trouble, but the journalists have their own trouble at the same time. There is a big trouble in the world with the media and the independent journalists. So it's we have to have them like our allies, but it would be hard to assess. This was my general comments. Specifically regarding the likely voter model, I feel, in my experience in Uruguay, we have 20 years of non-mandatory voting in the primaries. I have tried with socio-demographic and political models, but at the end of the day, I feel that the problem is that we have a strong correlation between people willing to answer public opinion polls are related to people willing to vote in the non-mandatory election. So we have it's not a problem of our data set, it's the problem of how we calibrate the people that don't answer our surveys. And we need to adjust our models with more information about the characteristics of the people that reject our surveys.
I can't agree more with you, Ignacio. And thank you very much for listening. And it was a pleasure seeing you all, even if it's only a moment. Hello, Senia. I see you there. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you so much, Marta. And thank you, everybody, for attending this keynote address. We're going to close out now because we need to start another paper session on the history of WAPOR coming up in just a moment. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.